Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Boost CYAC's webinar series. My name is Rhonelle Bruder, and I will be hosting a webinar today. So before we begin the session, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items. So first, participants listening in French, click on the floor at the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on the documents on the right. Feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on the documents on the right. There will be a Q&A after the presentation. It'll last approximately 5 minutes. And so to submit your questions, please use the toolbar on the right, click on messaging and then participants and type in your questions. And you can submit your questions at any time during the presentation. And then once I'm done, I'll go into the question box and we'll go through them and I can start to answer some of your questions. If you're watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking on messaging and then participants. Okay, so now we're going to begin our discussion. So I will start to share my screen with all of you. And thank you for your patience, everybody. Okay. 1 second. So today's presentation is on COVID-19 and commercial sex trafficking and the amplified impact on vulnerable youth. I think every single one of us has been impacted by COVID-19 over the last 8-9 months. We've seen increased social isolation from friends and family. There's been an economic downturn. There's been an overwhelming amount of job loss. Our mental health has been impacted. We've seen an increase in intimate partner violence and substance abuse. All these things have impacted every single one of us, but particularly vulnerable and at-risk youth are at high risk during COVID-19. And through this presentation, I want to examine one, commercial sex trafficking, what it is, try to really unpack what it is and how it happens, and then who are these young people that are vulnerable to sex trafficking, and how has COVID-19 amplified that? And then lastly, how as we as community members, service providers, and the adults, how can we protect and arm and empower these young and vulnerable youth? So first, we'll do some introductions. Again, I said my name is Rhonelle Bruder. I'm the founder and executive director of Project iRISE. I'm a public speaker, anti-trafficking advocate, and consultant. I'm also a survivor of human trafficking. So my work in human trafficking is not only professional, but it's very personal. And so in this, I'm going to be speaking to how trafficking happens at both that personal level of my understanding of my experiences and my experiences working with other survivors. Project iRISE. Project iRISE, as I mentioned before, I'm the founder and executive director. We are a survivor-led, community-based, not-for-profit organization. We provide innovative skills and leadership development programs and opportunities for survivors of human trafficking and those at risk. And those at risk are vulnerable young people. So our main focus is on education. So we focus on the most at-risk youth to create awareness and understanding of what trafficking is and how they can better protect and arm themselves. Advocacy, that's through campaigns and fundraising, and also working to inform policy. Partnerships, so we understand the importance of community partnerships in the anti-trafficking space, and we've already reached out and collaborated multiple different partners. And mentorship. Our survivor-led peer mentorship program that we are developing will focus on empowering survivors and creating survivor leaders, so allowing the survivor voice to be a leading part of the anti-trafficking movement. If you want to learn more about Project iRISE, please follow us on social media. We're on all the platforms at Project iRISE. You can email us info@projectirise, and our website is www.projectirise.org. Okay. So now let's get into our presentation. How trafficking happens. This is, and the reason why I want to start at this very basic root of how trafficking happens. In this conversation, we focused on commercial sex trafficking. So we will not be talking about labor trafficking, forced marriage, or domestic servitude, which are other forms of human trafficking recognized in Canada. And the reason why I wanted to start this very rudimentary understanding of trafficking is because there's been a lot of mistruths and misunderstanding, particularly in the last 6 months about trafficking. There's been conspiracies that have been abound everywhere on the internet. And a lot of times what that does, it misinforms the general public, but also it misinforms youth who are particularly vulnerable to being victimized by trafficking. So what is sex trafficking? Definition is the use of force, fraud, and coercion to make someone engage in commercial sex acts. So let's break that down for a second. Force, well, we understand that it's physical force, someone forcing someone to do that. Fraud, and that can be many times in different ways, lying to somebody, promises of a jobs that don't exist and opportunities. And then coercion. Coercion is maybe the one that's a little bit trickier to understand. It's that psychological, that manipulation that traffickers can use to force somebody into exploitation. Trafficking exists if any one of these things are occurring. Does not have to be all of them, but at least one of them occurs for trafficking to happen. But any commercial sexual activity with a minor, even without the use of force, fraud, or coercion, is considered sex trafficking. Look at some Canadian statistics, and these statistics were taken from Statistics Canada. They are police reported data, and they start from 2009. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that these are police reported data is because trafficking is a highly underreported crime. And so the data that we have and the data that I'm presenting to you and the data that is available is only that has been reported. And so it's not really an accurate picture of how trafficking is and who's being impacted in this country. But based on the statistics that we do have, we know that 93% of victims of sex trafficking are Canadian citizens and permanent residents. So this kind of counters a lot of ideas of who are the victims of trafficking. It's not people being brought into this country. Although that still does happen, we're seeing that less and less. And now we're seeing what we call domestic sex trafficking happening to Canadian citizens and permanent residents. It's predominantly impacting women and girls. So 97% of all reported cases of sex trafficking, the victims have been women and girls. But again, as I said in the very beginning of this slide, this is reported cases of sex trafficking. When it comes to boys and men, we do know that they are being impacted by sex trafficking, particularly boys and men who identify as LGBTQ+. However, for many reasons, stigmatization, the shame that society bears on men, particularly men who have been impacted by sexual violence, homophobia, and transphobia, we don't have accurate data points for how many men and boys have been victimized by sex trafficking. Over 74% of victims are under the age of 25 when first trafficked. I'm emphasizing the word first because, yes, victims tend to be very young. The average age, I believe, of sex trafficking victim is 17. However, victims of trafficking will often be re-trafficked and re-exploited for multiple years, even decades of their life. So although their first victimization may have been before the age of 25, that by no means means that women over the age of 25 are not being victimized by sex trafficking. Ontario is considered the hub of trafficking in Canada. 2/3 of cases, reported cases, are coming from Ontario. A couple different reasons why that may be. One is that Ontario has a very robust system when it comes to human trafficking. There's a lot of education and awareness happening in Canada, particularly within Ontario. And so this may have increased the reported cases coming from Ontario. Also, we know that there's a 401 highway, this highway that connects all the cities and towns in Ontario, and makes a very easy route for traffickers to move their victims from city to city and town to town. Despite being only 4% of the population, Indigenous women and girls account for over 50% of victims in Canada. This is a shocking statistic that every single one of us should be appalled by. Only 4% of the population, yet still Indigenous women and girls count for over 50% of victims of sex trafficking. And lastly, 92% of victims knew the person accused of trafficking them. Most commonly, victims were trafficked by a friend or an acquaintance. So again, this counters a lot of misconceptions about trafficking, that it's a stranger that will traffic somebody. We know that that's not the case. 92% of victims are being trafficked by a family member, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or an acquaintance. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on a video for us all to watch. So just give me 1 second, and apologize if it's a little bit challenging, but I want to pull up a very important video that I think will really help better explain what human trafficking is. So thank you again for your patience, and we'll turn it on. Called sex trafficking. I know, it's been in the news a lot lately, and you're probably thinking it could never happen to you or any of your friends. But the truth is, sex trafficking is already happening across Canada. Young Canadian girls and boys, some the same age as you or even younger, and from all different backgrounds and ethnicities, become victims of trafficking. And most of them have no idea it was even happening until it was too late. My name is Rhonelle Bruder, and I'm a sex trafficking survivor and an anti-trafficking advocate. So what is sex trafficking? It's when a person, generally a vulnerable underage youth, is lured, tricked, and manipulated into selling their body for sex to make money for somebody else. So how does it happen? It typically starts with luring, where traffickers will look for vulnerable young people to connect with. And this can happen anywhere, like at school, the mall, or even online. It can be something that seems innocent, like sending a message on social media, like, "Hey, beautiful." If they get a reply, that's the first step in the luring process. They'll try to learn as much as possible about the person and their life. This may not seem like a bad thing, but traffickers will use this information to manipulate the person later on. Next is the grooming. Traffickers will use all the information they gathered to play in the person's emotions and any insecurities they have, like problems with their parents, school, anxiety, or body image issues. Then they may get love bombed, meaning within a really short period of time, the trafficker showers the victim with attention, expensive gifts, trips, even drugs and alcohol to impair their judgment. Next is the manipulation and control. At this point, the victim thinks the trafficker is their boyfriend, girlfriend, or even best friend. But here, they'll really start to push the boundaries and pressure the victim to do things they aren't comfortable with, while slowly isolating them from family and friends. That's what leads to exploitation. This might start with working in a massage parlor or stripping at a club. They'll tell the victim, "It's just this once," or think about how much money they'll make. Then it progresses into sex acts. And if the victim tries to say no or leave, the trafficker may threaten them or become violent. Sex trafficking is real, and it's happening right here to young Canadian women and men. So remember how trafficking happens, and talk to a trusted friend or adult if you feel that you or your friends may be in danger. And lastly, if something seems too good to be true, trust your instincts. Thanks for listening. Okay, that was, I'm gonna pull up the screen again. So thank you. If anyone was unable to see that, then we will also, if you look in the chat box, I put the link for the video. So if for any reason, if there was some audio issues or if just the quality wasn't too good, or if you just want to be able to watch it later on, please, or share it. It is in the chat box, the link is on YouTube. That was a video that was created by myself and my team for the Human Trafficking Awareness Day in Ontario, which is February 22nd. That was meant to be a very high-level overview of what sex trafficking is for parents, for young people, to really start to broach that conversation. So when you watch the video, you're able to see how trafficking happens and really the stages of commercial sexual exploitation. So who's at risk to being trafficked? And I know in the video I said everyone is vulnerable. Any young person is vulnerable to being trafficked and exploited. And that is absolutely true. However, there are certain groups and certain populations of young people that have much higher risk of exploitation. And those are females. As we know, females are predominantly victims of sex trafficking. Indigenous community, as again we know within the data, the LGBTQ plus community, Black and racialized young people, migrants and new immigrants, and marginalized and disenfranchised communities. So these are the people that are at highest risk to be exploited. They will often have a history of physical or sexual abuse within their childhood, mental health, substance abuse disorder, involvement within the criminal justice system. They will lack a support system. So they will lack that family support system or community support system, or at least that one trusted adult in their life. And youth that are street involved or homeless. But all young people are vulnerable to being exploited. But of course, there are always going to be young people that are at higher risk for exploitation and trafficking. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the signs. So what are the signs that somebody is a victim of sex trafficking and exploitation? So one thing we can think of is appearance. So how the person is dressed. A young person that would be dressed inappropriate for the weather. But it's also a young person that could have very expensive clothing, things that normally they would not be accustomed to, you're not normally seeing them wearing. You may see things, branding and bruising. When talking about branding, we're talking about tattoos. So often traffickers will force or coerce their victims to tattoo their name, a symbol, something to signify that that victim belongs to that trafficker. Signs of self-harm, abuse. When we think of demeanor, we think things of hostile or angry. Someone could also be nervous, anxious, fearful, and submissive. It's important to understand that everybody responds differently to trauma. So some people may come across as very angry, combative, aggressive, and other people may come across as very timid, very scared. Both are being impacted by trauma. It's just a different way of coping mechanisms that we develop. So it's important that we don't create an idea or a vision of what a victim of trafficking looks like in our mind, because anybody can be a victim, as we know, and the way that they respond and their outward behavior might not be one that you might suspect would be associated with being a victim. And lastly, language. So this is if you're working closely with a young person, these are some terms you might hear them saying. So they might speak openly about sex in a way that it's not typically normally for a young person to speak so openly about sexual partners and different sexual positions or things that they're doing. Might use words like John, trick, which refers to clients, or the life or the game, which talks about being involved within the sex industry. They might use the term boyfriend or daddy or my man. But of course, all these things can happen and someone may not be a victim of sex trafficking, and none of these things may occur and someone could still be a victim of sex trafficking. So it's important to know the signs and the potential indicators, but know that they're only just potential signs. They're not all of them. So why do victims stay? Why do victims not immediately leave when they're being victimized, when they're being exploited by their traffickers? And to really understand that is to understand the dynamics of trafficking and how traffickers are able to exert such control, both physically and mentally, over their victims. And I love this visual, this image. This is from the Polaris Institute in the United States, and it's called the Sex Trafficking Power and Control Wheel, and to focus on these different areas in which traffickers can use to exert their power and control of victims. So emotional abuse, isolation, isolating their victims from their family and friends, slowly isolating them so that the trafficker is the only person in their life. Denying, blaming, minimizing, so gaslighting, making the person feel like they're slowly going crazy, the things that they believe happened didn't really happen. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, this can be from the trafficker, this can also be from other people. Using privilege, so if the trafficker has a position of privilege or power in the community, particularly if it's a family member. Economic abuse, traffickers will take usually almost all of the money of their victims or completely all of it. So this means the victim has no means of escaping, no ability to leave. Coercion and threats, these can be threats directly against the victim or their family and friends. So there's just some of the ways in which traffickers can use to control their victims. But it's important to remember that when someone is being victimized by a trafficker, they often do not see themselves as a victim. They oftentimes will see themselves as someone who might be in a relationship. Again, if you remember in the video, we talked about that grooming process and how they're building that trust and that bond with that victim. And so oftentimes victims see this as their boyfriend, this is their best friend. They do not identify that person as someone who's exploiting them. Even with all of the abuse and the trauma that we're talking about, they still may not recognize them themselves. So it's important when you're working with young people who have been victims of sex trafficking and exploitation. You don't force titles on them. You don't force terms on them. You allow them to come to that on their own conclusion. So why do victims go back? So even when a victim has been rescued and been removed from their trafficker, oftentimes what we see is a cycle of re-exploitation and re-traumatization, where victims will go back either to the life, so go back to working in the sex industry, which again will increase their likelihood of being re-traumatized and re-trafficked, or they'll go back to their trafficker. This happens for a couple different reasons. One is feelings of attachment to that trafficker, traumatic bonding, Stockholm syndrome. So again, to the points that I was speaking about earlier, that bond that's created in that grooming phase where the trafficker takes the time to get to know that victim, takes the time to build a relationship with that victim. They believe this is someone that cares about them. And if you understand the way traumatic bonding works, it's cycles between positive and negative. So a trafficker going from being that loving, caring person to that violent monster, and the victim constantly in this loop of trying to get that trafficker back to that caring person that they initially met when they were being groomed. There's also misinformation and false promises. Traffickers will promise their victims a multitude of things: a new life, trips, money, condos, cars, jobs, all these things to keep them under their control. Distrustment of law enforcement. Traffickers, one thing they'll almost always do is tell the victim that they cannot trust law enforcement, because they know if the victim does engage with law enforcement, there's potential that they will be discovered. So they will manipulate and brainwash that person to believe that law enforcement cannot be trusted. And lastly, feelings and attachment to the life and the game, which also is defined as identity disturbance. So victims working within the sex industry, working within what we call the life, becomes so normalized after a while, particularly when they've been in it for many years. And oftentimes going back into the real world, as we would call it, can be very challenging, particularly when they've lost communication from family and friends, they feel isolated, and the life is all they know. So we do see a lot of victims go back into the game, back into the sex industry, and that cycle can continue. That's the reason why a lot of the work we do at Project iRISE is working to empower survivors, help build up their voice, but also give them the skills and the tools that they need to be financially successful outside of the sex industry. So how has COVID-19 amplified vulnerability? And I said this at the top of this presentation, that everyone has been impacted by COVID-19. I know I have, everybody has, but it's amplified vulnerability, particularly for certain groups. And this is what we want to pay attention to. And so I found this in the pediatric peer-reviewed journal, and I loved this quote. So I just put it right here. Already vulnerable populations are bearing the brunt of the health impacts of COVID-19. This amplified impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable populations has important implications for individuals at risk of being exploited and human trafficking. And I think that really says it perfectly and clearly, that these people who are vulnerable are not vulnerable because of COVID-19. They were already vulnerable. COVID-19 has only amplified that risk. So these are communities, these are our marginalized young people, our Black, our Indigenous, our LGBTQ+, our youth that are in homes that are not safe, our youth that are on the street or street involved and homeless youth. So these are already vulnerable young people who are now being amplified because of COVID-19, the risk for sexual exploitation and trafficking. So some emerging issues. So some issues that have come board. And I don't know if emerging issues is even the best title for this slide, because I think amplified issues might be better. But isolation. One of the impacts of COVID-19 and this global pandemic is social isolation. We've all been forced inside. I live in Ontario, and currently we're in stage 2. So we've gone back into further isolations due to increases in the cases in Ontario. So when we think of vulnerable youth and how that makes them at greater risk, we have increased rates of intimate partner violence, violence in the home. So that means child abuse, domestic and intimate partner violence within the home. So young people are being exposed to more violence, sexual violence, financial insecurity. COVID-19 has created great, vast economic distress across the board for many people. People have lost their jobs and their livelihoods. So due to businesses shutdowns, mass layoffs, many young people and their families are going to be financially impacted. This is increasingly and overwhelmingly impacting our low-wage workers, contract workers, seasonal workers, workers that don't have reliable permanent employment, that don't necessarily have access to additional health benefits. These are the ones that are going to be the most impacted, and their families. Access to services. Due to mass closures and reduced hours, youth face a lack of resources they've relied on. Talking about housing, education, and transportation. But this access to service is nothing new. And this is why I said when I looked at this slide again right now, I think it should say amplified issues, because access to services has impacted vulnerable communities for a long time. We know Indigenous communities, particularly within northern parts of Ontario, have lacked access to basic services like clean water. We know that communities, low-income communities here in the GTA where I live, lack access to services, after-school programming, safe homes and communities to live in. So this is nothing new. COVID-19 has only amplified that. Social barriers. Due to stay-at-home orders, youth will increasingly be using online resources for social interaction. And this is across the board. This is youth from all different backgrounds, all socioeconomic backgrounds are being increasingly using social media and online for school, to hang out with their friends. They can't meet in person, so they're doing Zoom. So we have social media, we have gaming, and we have remote sex work. So remote sex work, what I'm talking about is things like OnlyFans, sites that have popped up that have been promoted to young people, even though the minimum age requirement is 18. There are ways to circumvent that and get around that. And there are young people that are accessing these sites that may seem appealing, and they may also seem like they're low risk. Because it's online and it's remote, they may feel that this is a way to make extra money, support themselves, potentially their families, and not put themselves as much in danger as they would if it was in-person sex work. The reality is this is just as dangerous, because this opens up a pathway into sex work and in-person sex work, and also increases their exposure to people, predators, and traffickers. So it's important for young people to know that remote sex work, any sort of online sex work, is as dangerous and will increase their vulnerability for sexual exploitation and trafficking. So online activity, I think this is the one that probably most parents, community members, teachers are concerned about. And if you think back to the video, we talked about the stages of commercial sexual exploitation. And it seemed as if, or at least in that video, we were portraying it as if the person meets the trafficker online, but the actual exploitation would happen in person and the grooming process would happen in person. But that doesn't have to be the case. Young people can be exploited fully online without ever having to meet their trafficker in person. So I'm just going to go through step by step how the stages of commercial sexual exploitation can happen completely online. So luring, again, something simple as that message of hello, beautiful. We know that young people share everything, particularly on social media platforms, TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram. Traffickers are able to also follow these hashtags. My life sucks, hate my parents. They're able to track these and to see who's posting these messages and reach out and engage with young people with a simple hello, beautiful message. Once they've been able to make that connection, once that's there, then they can begin the grooming process. And again, that can be showing attention, compliments, online engagement. This can be somebody sending, and particularly within gaming, you can actually send money virtually to somebody. They can e-transfer money to a young person. They can be messaging them, talking to them on the phone. So even though they've never met them in person, they're still able to fully groom somebody online. Manipulation and control. So pressure or threat for the victims, maybe to send sexually explicit imagery and videos. It may not start off that way. It may start off with just send me a selfie, a picture of your face, and then send me a picture of yourself in a bikini. And slowly they will persist until they can get, which we considered child sexual abuse material, formerly known as child pornography. This can be now used to blackmail the victims, threats to share this with their family or their friends, expose this online. And now the young person is being exploited. They may now feel that they have to continue to supply this illegal material to the trafficker. And now they feel that they're under the trafficker's control. So of course, online activity is a high risk for sexual exploitation and for trafficking amongst young people. But there's another area that I think is really important that we talk about when we talk about this high risk for young people, and that's sex trafficking intersectionality. It's a conversation that's being had quite a bit recently, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we think about vulnerability and who's at risk to trafficking. And we know that any young person potentially could be vulnerable because traffickers are tapping into those insecurities, that low self-esteem. They're tapping into those types of things to exploit. But they're also tapping into young people who have very obvious vulnerabilities, such as homeless youth that are detached from family and friends. So when we think of things that make them increase vulnerability, race, gender, identity, sexuality, nationality, class, economics, and religion. And so how does these intersectionalities increase vulnerability? Well, young people that identify in any one of these and carry these different intersectionalities may be likely to face systemic racism and oppression, homophobia, transphobia. They're more likely to have a lower socioeconomic status. And so there's that wealth gap. They're more likely to be unemployed or underemployed. So they're working those low wage jobs I was talking about before. They're working those contract jobs without benefits and without security. They're less likely to be identified or seen as a victim and to be able to access services and programs. That last one is really important, access services and programs. So a lot of young people, particularly our young people that are high at risk, are unable to access the services and programs that they're most in need of. This is why it's so important. We cannot expect young people to come to us, but we have to come to them. We also have to make sure and remove any barriers to accessing these care and these services. So maintaining support for vulnerable youth. So we know we have young people, particularly certain groups that are higher risk for exploitation and trafficking. What can we do as community members, parents, and service providers? One thing is help youth create a safety plan that includes tools to manage their physical, mental health, as well as their well-being and financial security. Because the reality is, vulnerable youth are now probably facing increased financial concerns, loss of jobs, maybe no job at all, or a very low paying job. This will now increase their likelihood to potentially engage in riskier behaviors, doing things to be able to find financial means and financial security. So we need to be able to create safety plans that incorporate that factor of their financial security, making sure we include physical and mental health. Not everyone has access to benefits that allow them to see a therapist, that allow them to go to physiotherapy. So how can we make sure and help young people access these services? Build resiliency. Help youth by sharing tools and resources to strengthen resilience. Resiliency is probably something that I talk about the most, and the importance of resiliency, particularly for our vulnerable youth. So building those tools of resiliency with young people, helping them to create their own toolkit for resiliency. And everyone's can look different. So thinking about having that positive thinking, helping them work on positive thinking, that's not something that just comes naturally to everybody. It's a learned behavior. Helping them create that support network. It's very important to have that support network. It doesn't always have to be family. Some young people are estranged from family and are not able to have that safety within their family home. But that can come from community. It can come from their service, their friends. It can come from service providers. But having that safety net is so important for young people. And also focusing, again, we talked about that mental and physical health. That is so important. That physical activity, ensuring they have access to nutritious food, ability to exercise, to move around, to get that physical activity, and also on their mental health. There are many free services now that provide mental health. And so there are ways to access that through agencies and online services. Help youth access services such as housing and food banks. So this is really about ensuring that young people have that access to those services, being able to there and sort of walk them through and help them and refer them to the services that are available. Because of COVID-19, there's been an increased demand on an already under-resourced system. Our housing system, as we know, has been under-resourced for years. The increasing homelessness that we're seeing right now is only amplified because of COVID-19. So young people, particularly vulnerable young people, they need our support to be able to access these services. Collaborate with other agencies to maximize supports and resources. I think COVID-19, if anything, has showed us the importance of collaboration. No agency, no service provider can do this on their own. Each one of us brings something unique and different to the table. I know with Project iRISE, we provide long-term supports for survivors. We focus on education, building resiliency, and leadership. But we're not able to support survivors who are in crisis and who need that type of support. So when we find people in our community, we know to refer them. So it's important to create these relationships across our agencies and across within the anti-trafficking space. And I mean, I am a big believer in community coming together to the betterment of society. This is one of my favorite quotes from Margaret Mead, so I'll read this out. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I know every single viewer, every single listener, all the agencies that are working to protect and keep our children safe are committed to doing this work. So we already know we have that. It's just a matter of us working together and us making sure we're able to go out and reach those that are most vulnerable, so we make sure that they're protected. As far as resources, so again, please feel free to reach out to me and to reach out to Project iRISE if you are looking for long-term supports for survivors. We also do branding removal for survivors of trafficking. But if you want information on what services are available across Canada, I highly recommend that you contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. It's run through the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. The number is 1-833-900-1010. They provide confidential, toll-free, 24/7 services, and they have a directory of all the services across Canada. So this is a number that you want to have, even if you don't need services or you don't need a referral, but you just want more information. You want to understand how trafficking happens, or maybe you suspect someone is being victimized. Okay. So thank you very much. This was our presentation. I will stop sharing my screen and I'll go back for a Q&A question period. Okay. Okay, so okay. So I don't know if I'm going to look if there's any questions. So I think people are asking, the slides will be made available. So all the slides will be made available for everybody. So that should not be an issue if you need that. They'll provide it within a PDF, so you'll be able to get that. So I don't have any questions, but we still have some time. So I still, I think, add something. So this is not on the presentation, but I think COVID-19 for all of us, we've really seen how this has impacted, and we don't know what's happening. So I think this is really important, is we don't know what the future is going to be like. There is so much uncertainty happening right now within COVID-19 and what's happening in our country and all over the world. And so it's important that we build up a resilient system now. because we don't know what's going to happen after. I mean, we think about the job loss that we've already seen. If we think about the increased mental health, we have increased suicide, substance abuse, overdoses. There's so many different social ills and things that COVID-19 is impacting. We've increased rates of domestic violence. All these things that are happening right now, but we don't know what's going to happen in a year or a year or two. And when we think about sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, we have traffickers, we have people who are used to making sums of money that maybe now have been restricted. Yes, there is online remote sexual activity. Yes, there is other ways to exploit young people, but that in person has been limited. So what's going to happen when all of a sudden everything goes back to normal? How will vulnerable young people be increased in their vulnerability? How will their situation for communities that are already marginalized be even further marginalized? So I think now is the time to not only help the young people and the vulnerable young people, but also do a little bit of preventative work and start to think about the future and what potentially the future is going to look like and what we need to do to ensure the young people are safe in our post-COVID world. So that's just my own personal opinion on the situation. I think COVID-19 has just highlighted so many things and just amplified so many insecurities and lack of resources that have already existed within our system. And now is a time, I think, where we've had a little bit, maybe there's been a light that's been shone on this, a light that's been shone on things that maybe perhaps we didn't talk about before. And if we can improve society in general, if we can increase and make better housing, if we can have better access to healthcare, better support for people who are suffering from substance abuse, if we can create better systems and supports and care for victims of intimate partner violence, I mean, we can do little things now to create a system in the community that'll be better off to protect young people in the future. So that's just my personal opinion. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple questions. I'm just going to look through now. So someone's asking, how are the housing needs usually met? Hold on. So, okay, I see a couple questions now. I think they all just came in. Sorry, guys. I didn't see them before. So how are the housing usually met? So normally youth that are in need of housing are able to access agencies and then get referrals to housing. There also is youth homeless shelters that are across the city that have beds that take in youth. So there is access, but permanent housing, permanent long-term housing is where we lack. So when we have shelters and short-term housing, there are support systems for youth. But when we're thinking about long-term housing, I think that's where we really need to do a lot more work to create those. And I know that the government has been talking about creating more long-term housing. That is really something where more work needs to be done. Okay, so I'm now going to scroll back up because I just missed all the questions. I apologize. Okay. How do you encourage healthy relationships with at-risk youth? I think that's a really good question because at-risk youth have already experienced negative relationships many times. They've already experienced abuse and trauma. So their trust and their ability to trust has already been damaged. So I think it's setting that example. It's being that trust for that person. They can see there is somebody that actually cares and that wants nothing from them. There's nothing for them to gain from it. And by doing this, you have to be authentic. And I say this all the time when I do presentations, is when I was a kid, like I could go into any room and I could tell a social worker, a caseworker, whoever the person might be, I could tell how they thought about me within 2 seconds. 2 seconds, I can tell. I can tell by someone's body language. I mean, so you have to really be authentic in your care and your work. You have to take away any bias you have against people because young people can feel that. And people who are already marginalized, people who are already vulnerable, that only reinforces their belief that you don't care, that nobody cares and they're alone. So to be able to create trust, you have to be real and authentic and come from a place of genuine caring, which I know people are, so I'm not saying people aren't, but it's just something to be mindful of. Body language, it speaks louder than words often. But again, to encourage, I think, healthy relationships is I think we need more training for young people as far as understanding what is a healthy relationship. Even the most basic of things, there's maybe the misconception that every person knows what a healthy relationship is, but how many young people, especially young people that are already marginalized or at risk, know that if they meet somebody and they're buying them expensive gifts, that's a red flag. so even sometimes things like that, like what does a healthy relationship look like? And there is educational and training materials. I know within Ontario, there is going to be curriculum that's specifically on healthy relationships coming. I don't know if it's already came into the 2020 curriculum, but I think being able to provide young people with workshops, there are many organizations that do those workshops. One, I know Aurora Freedom, they provide workshops, and there's plenty more. So if you want some, please reach out to me. But they do provide workshops on healthy relationships that I think all young people should be attending. Just going to go through. With education can be shown shared with parents, preteens for awareness. So again, so that YouTube video that we created it's 3 minutes, it's short, and it really gets to the point. It's simple, it's concise on what trafficking is. I think that's a great entry point to sort of broach that conversation. Parents can share it with their young people. They can watch it together, they can watch it separately. But also, if you're a service provider, this is a great, I think, for service providers to watch this video to get a better understanding, and even to have some of the young people that you work with watch the video and have a conversation after. What did you think? Have you ever been online and someone reached out to you? I did a workshop with a bunch of youth, and I asked them, "Has anyone ever reached out to you online?" Every single hand went up. Has anyone ever propositioned you? Or every single hand went up. Like every single hand said that they had been propositioned online by somebody that said, "Hey, do you want to do bottle service? Do you want to be a model? Do you want to do this?" So young people are being exposed to this. So it's happening. It's already happening. So we just need to start having these conversations with them. Um, Thank you. What's the term about identity change you mentioned? So that really it's identity disturbance. So it's where when you're working, so traffickers, part of that grieving process is to change the way the victim thinks about sex. So it's as opposed to sex being between a relationship between people who care about each other, but now sex being something for profit. So the idea of sex and money being intertwined. Traffickers will oftentimes do things by actually, after having sex with the victim, give them money. So it's slowly shifting that idea that with sex comes money. And so when someone has that and it's being fully sort of, I guess, brainwashed to believe that, and now they're working in that life, they're working in the sex industry where those two are always together, they begin to sort of believe that this is the way things are. This is what it is. You have sex with someone, you should be getting paid for it. You're in this life of fast life, quick money, quick cash. It's not just the sex industry, it's also a lifestyle. And it could be almost addictive, that lifestyle. It can also be very hard to remove yourself from and to then try to reintegrate back into society. And so this is why they're so important that survivors have supports, and why we always advocate at Project iRISE for long-term supports. We need that immediate crisis care, but we also need those long-term supports. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead. And if that didn't further explain it, please let me know. You guys, you can reach out to me directly. You can reach out to Boost if you have any questions. They'll forward them to me. How can human service frontline workers support victim survivors of human trafficking, children's service housing? Okay. Sorry. So how can you support? Well, I think first of all, education is key. Education is number one. You cannot support someone if you don't fully understand what that experience is. So I think every agency should be trained, and not just agencies that directly work with victims of trafficking, because there are many young people that you're working with that potentially are going to be victims of trafficking or could be in the future. So I think we need to make sure that all people, frontline workers, are trained, that there's a thorough education, and education that's continual, because things change. Like I was saying about the remote sex, the OnlyFans, I mean, that's something that's relatively new. I mean, online and camming has happened for a while, but things will constantly change. We need to stay abreast with how the situations are, because traffickers they are very in tune with how society is changing, how tastes are changing. They know that. So it's up to us to make sure that we're not just educating ourselves, but we're constantly re-educating ourselves. Okay, so what else? What are some of the most common myths about sex trafficking that people have shared with you? Number one is that it is not happening here. It's it's girls coming from Eastern Europe, from Asia, that are being brought to Canada and being trafficked. I think the movie Taken, and I love the movie, but I think it did a lot of damage in the way that people think of trafficking as these international gangs that are bringing people across borders. And that's another thing. People always assume that it has to be transported across borders to be someone to be trafficked. Someone can be trafficked in their home. They've never left their home and they're a victim of trafficking. So I think there's that one piece to it. And the fact that what we're seeing increasingly across North America is domestic sex trafficking. We're seeing that Romeo pimp, that relationship. And I think that's harder for people to identify because you might see a victim and a trafficker on the street and they look like boyfriend and girlfriend. So it's harder to, and if you're talking to a victim, they might identify that person as their boyfriend, because this is kind of what we're seeing now. The traffickers are also younger. They're not men who are, 10, 15 years older than their victim. We're seeing traffickers that are the same age as their victim, 16-year-olds trafficking 16-year-olds. So I think who is the trafficker and who is the victim and how that plays out is a lot different, and it's changing. And again, like I said, this is why that education piece is so important, but that re-education, because things will constantly change. So we need to be aware of what's happening today and not thinking about what was happening 10, 20 years ago, but what does trafficking look like today and who's vulnerable today? Okay, so, oh, okay. What would your approach be to a child who has been admitted to inpatient psychiatry, who will not disclose that they are victims of sex trafficking, but is known to being trafficked? Well, I think, and I had said that before, you never want to tell somebody, you never want to give a title to somebody. You don't want to, you're a victim of trafficking. This is your trafficker. This is something that they need to come to the realization on their own, but you can help them in that process. Help them by educating them, providing educational tools for them on trafficking, on relationships, and hopefully they're having support, psychiatric support and therapy, so they can sort of do that trauma work, because there's a lot of trauma that they need to sort of unpack. And through that work with trusted individuals, they will be able to come to that realization on their own that they've been a victim of trafficking, only when they see it on their own. Because if you're telling somebody and you're trying to save them, it won't work. It won't work in the long term. They have to come to that realization on their own, and they have to want on their own for their life to be better and for them to remove themselves. Otherwise, what you'll see is a lot of times victims going back, and they keep going back, and they keep going back. I know that's frustrating for service providers, and it's not that they're not doing a good job, but it's that that victim has to come to the conclusion on their own many times. And so I think being able to provide them with that education and not saying you're a victim, but this is something, this is something that's happening. This is a reality that's happening. And hopefully through that work, through their trauma work, they're able to slowly recognize their own victimization. Okay. Oh, so someone's just saying that they have a program that specifically supports young women who are at risk and have been exploited, and also has a group to educate and empowers young men. Elizabeth Fry Society, and then are you hearing about crystal meth being used? So yes, so particularly within the LGBTQ plus community, crystal meth is rampant. It is being used, and it is a way to introduce young men using crystal meth as a form to obviously control them and exploit them. So this is an area that I did not touch on, and there has not been enough information and awareness about the LGBTQ plus community and sex trafficking and drug use. And this is something that we definitely need to delve into, and it definitely needs more support for this community. We're seeing an increase in Quebec of girls who go into the life for adventurous reasons at first. It's something you're seeing in Ontario as well. Absolutely. And I think it's how the pimps, the traffickers, how they groom the girls, right? They make the life sound exciting. It's an opportunity for nice things, cars, condos, shopping trips. And this is what they're seeing initially. Oftentimes they're buying them these expensive things. And so they're making the life seem glamorous. Oftentimes other girls who are being trafficked will be used to recruit other girls. And they will also do the same thing, reinforcing how glamorous and fun the life is. And so for a lot of young women, particularly young, vulnerable young people, it's easy to be lured into that. And by the time they figure out what's going on, it's often too late. They're now often under control of the trafficker. Maybe they're physically restrained by their trafficker. There's physical abuse, there's violence, there's drug use. And now they have to try to find a way, if they can, to escape that situation. So a lot of times I do see that the life has been glamorized to a lot of young people. Oh, this question came in before, I think was missed. What is the priority of reconnecting with schooling? So as far as I want to clarify, is this in-person schooling, or I'm not sure if that's, maybe I missed the question. But I think, I mean, we're just thinking about young people and schooling and being online, but also not being able to access that community, that network that they relied on, and at home doing online schooling. It's increased vulnerability, but increased also lack of social isolation and mental health. And so we can understand why they would be more vulnerable to being exploited. Um, Hopefully our young people will be able to go back to in-person schooling at some point, but I would also like to say that young people are also exploited and groomed and lured in schools. So this is happening in school. So it is important that we have education within our school system, within our curriculum, that talks about trafficking, because it is happening in schools across Ontario, across Canada. Schooling K to 12. Yes, so we definitely need more education within the curriculum. I don't know if that was the question. Would you say there's a difference between sex work and sex trafficking, especially since people over 18 are engaging in one or both? So there is. So I know that sex trafficking and sex works often gets conflated, but they are separate. Sex trafficking is the use of control, the force, someone forcing somebody to perform sex work for their personal and financial benefit, whereas someone who's doing sex work, they're making their own hours, they're collecting all their own money, and if you're over the age of 18 in Canada, you legally can. Sex work is not illegal. It's illegal to be a buyer and legal to be a trafficker, but not illegal to be a sex worker. But then we also have circumstantial or survival sex, which is kind of in that middle area, where oftentimes someone who might be a victim of trafficking is able to escape their trafficker, but then goes back into survival sex because that's the only means of income and source of money they know how to make. Or again, maybe a little bit of what we talked about, that identity disturbance and feeling that the life is the only thing that they know and they're comfortable with. So it's not really black or white, I don't think, in my opinion. And then there is sex work, but someone can start off as a sex worker and end up being trafficked and exploited. So it's not clear. It's not necessarily linear in sort of how that works, but there is a difference as far as someone who's choosing to be a sex worker and someone who is being exploited and trafficked. Okay, I think that was it. So I think it is, and we are wrapping up. I know at 2 o'clock this will shut off right away and disconnect. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out. You can reach out to Boost. You can reach out to me directly. Oh, someone's saying, okay. Here's news. Yes. Yes, someone was just saying how sexualized behavior within youth is, yes, it is being normalized. But also, and I love someone pointed that out, how the life is being normalized, how, between, music videos, like television, everything that we're seeing, that fast money life has been glamorized. And so you have young people who, particularly young people who don't have access to family supports and community, and they're now being seduced by this fast life, this glamorous lifestyle. So I think it's very dangerous. Yeah. So if you have any other questions, please reach out. If you like to more about Project iRISE and the work that we're doing, we are located in Toronto, Ontario, so our work is specific to that catchment area. But please reach out, www.projectirise.org. And I think that's it. I don't think I can. I think hopefully I got every question. I'm trying to scroll back to see, but I think I did. If not, just please send your question if I wasn't able to address it. Um, Yes, I think that's it. Oh, I just saw someone said any videos for teens. So I know that the government of Ontario, I believe, created some videos. And also Covenant House has a really good video. Covenant House Toronto, if you go on their website, they created a sex trafficking awareness video. So they have their trafficking stop. So if you go there, you can see that. That's another agency that's doing a lot of work. Um, are we able to observe terms of sex trafficking on OnlyFans so far? So I can't say for sure if we have seen that. I haven't heard it reported, I guess I should say, but I think just from my own sort of understanding, I believe that it wouldn't be surprising to me if it hasn't already occurred, if it won't occur, because you're having young people that are now entering into the sex industry in what they believe is much safer sex work. Oh, okay. It's 2 o'clock. Okay, so thank you guys. Thank you, everybody. If you have any more questions, please just reach out. Thanks.